Hiya, so welcome back. We are, as you know, talking about anonymity, about what the law says about occasions when we cannot name people, we can't identify certain people, generally to do with um, vulnerable groups. We have been talking about juveniles, so now we're going to talk about uh, sexual offences and what the law says about anonymity concerning sexual offences. Um, so just to repeat the warning that we are going to be talking about sexual offences naturally. We're not going to be going into too much detail, but I do want to just flag up that we are talking about something which I know many people understandably find difficult to um, consider, but being able to report sexual offences is an important part of what we do. So if you're not comfortable listening to me talk about it or coming to the workshop, that's fine, but you must read McNay's chapters 10 and 11 in your own time to make sure you are aware of what the law says in this about this important area. So here's an example of a recent story in February this year about Libby Squire. Now, Libby Squire was a student, and she was, you may have seen her on the story on the news, she was raped and murdered by a man. And you'll see from that story that it contains certain details and certain pictures. And also, you might be aware from a story from last year, and it's still very much in the news at the moment, but Alex Salmond, the former leader of the Scottish National Party, he was accused of and cleared, and I stress he was cleared, of a series of sexual assaults. So against women over a period of years. So in that story about Libby Squire, you'll notice I've flagged up the details that are in there. So we've got a victim of a sexual crime. She was also killed. But so she's a rape victim, but here we have her name, we have her age, where she went to university, where she lives, names of her parents. So lots of detail about Libby Squire in this piece. So there's a question. The question is, why can we report this victim's name, whereas where we have this case, the Alex Salmond story, we are not naming the women who made the accusations. So just known as Women A, or Woman A. I think there were 9 women in total who made accusations against Alex Salmond. Now he was cleared of all the charges, but you can see from that example of an article that the women were just given pseudonyms, so Woman A, Woman B, Woman C, etc. So why can we not report on those alleged victims' names? So we're going to talk about why that might be and come back to these stories and look at the reasons. So starting off with the key legislation. The key legislation here is the Sexual Offences Amendment Act 1992, and that was further amended by the Sexual Offences Act 2003. So Sexual Offences Act 92 and Sexual Offences Act 2003. So you need to commit those to memory. So what do we mean by anonymity relating to sexual offences? Important point is that as soon as an allegation is made by anyone about anyone, there is anonymity, automatic anonymity applied to the victim. So if the victim makes a complaint, not necessarily to the police, just to anyone, if they flag up the fact that they believe they've been a victim of a sexual assault or a sexual offence, they are given anonymity under the law. So you could not report their identity from that point forward. And that anonymity lasts for the duration of their life. So it's an automatic, lifelong anonymity relating to that offence. It doesn't mean that if you're talking to them about something else, you can report on what they've been up to in the rest of their life. But when it comes to referring to the sexual offence, you cannot link their identity to that offence. And anonymity, it remains whatever happens, whether or not there's an investigation, whether the police are involved, whether there's a prosecution, or whether someone's ever found guilty of the offence, that anonymity remains. So as soon as they make the complaint, doesn't matter whether there's investigation, prosecution, or conviction, and it lasts for the victim's entire life. So the things we cannot report, obviously their name, the victim's address, educational establishment, the workplace, pictures, video, or still images, and really you just have to think to yourself, what information might identify that person who says they've been a victim of a sexual offence to anyone, not necessarily to everyone. So if you're identifying somebody to their own family, that would also, you would have breached their anonymity. So someone who knows the victim quite well, if you provide information which identifies them to that person, then you're still in breach. So there are a wide range of sexual offences. Now, I'm not planning to go through these in detail. You don't need me to talk about these. I would invite you to have a look at the full list that's in McNay's. It's important you understand what each of these terms mean. What does rape actually mean? What does a sexual assault mean? What does exposure mean? So have a look. They're unpleasant crimes by definition, but it's important that you understand what those definitions are. The one I would flag up is a recent addition to the list is upskirting, so taking pictures of a skirt. That has been added recently as a sexual offence, so it's important you're aware of that. I've said it's lifelong anonymity, no matter whether there's an investigation or whatever, but there are occasions when anonymity can be lifted. So if the victim, and the victim must be 16 years old or more, if they give you written consent, then you can name them, and it must be written consent, and that consent must be informed. So that in that written consent, it must say, I understand that I have a right to lifelong anonymity, however I wish to waive that right in order to be able to tell my story in full. If you get that written consent and they've signed it and dated it, that's fine. If you don't get written consent, you just get verbal consent, you've got no way of proving it. If they were to change their mind, or if there'd been a misunderstanding or whatever, you would not be able to prove that you had got that person's consent. So you must get written consent. There's also a situation known as a case other than a sexual offence. So, and this is, it's got a rare occurrence, but if, for instance, there's been a false claim of a sexual offence and that has led to a court case against somebody for wasting police time or perverting the course of justice, so somebody's lied about or accused of lying about raping or whatever, or being raped, whatever it might be, then that might lead to a court case, in which case you are able to name that person in court. That automatic lifelong anonymity which they were given when they made the complaint is waived, so that you can report on that allegation. It's important to just be aware of that. It's a rare incident. That's not something generally expect to happen, but if it does, then you can name people involved in those cases, and it might also be by the order of the court if the defendant thinks that it's in the interests of justice that they put their identity out there in order to maybe seek more witnesses or whatever it might be, or more evidence. The defendant can ask the court to lift the order, and also the court can lift it if they think there's the identity ban is creating a substantial or unreasonable restriction on the reporting. So let's look at a couple of examples. So in terms of someone giving consent, that's a Manchester Evening News story. These two women gave written consent to a reporter at the Manchester Evening News to say that they were happy that their anonymity was lifted so they could tell their story. And if you look at it, it's to do with their stepdad, so they wanted to make sure that it was clear what the actual nature of the crime was, a crime within a family that had happened. And obviously if you weren't able to identify them, you would not be able to identify that relationship with the person who was convicted of the sex abuse. Because if you talked about the stepdad, there was only one stepdad, so therefore it would have identified him. So they gave written consent for that. Next one to flag up. So another example of written consent. So Chloe Madeley, the daughter of Richard and Judy, she was the victim of rape threats, which is a sexual offence, and so she would have been given the automatic right for lifelong anonymity, and she would have had to give written consent for these front pages to have been published, revealing that she had been the victim of threats to rape. So they would have had to have got written consent from her to be able to report that story. I mentioned a case other than sexual offences alleged, and this is a very unusual case, and I'm always wary of suggesting this is a likely outcome, but on the occasional time when it's somebody is accused of lying about a rape allegation and they end up in court, then you are able to identify that person who's made that allegation, who's appearing in court. So the important thing is you don't come away with any impression that that's likely to happen if you were to make a complaint. That's in exceptional circumstances. If there was ever a time when you felt an allegation of a sexual offence should be made, you should absolutely highlight that. You shouldn't think that it's likely that you could be accused of making it up. And then the other situation is where the court decides that it would create a substantial or unreasonable reporting restriction in order to ban the identity of a victim. So this is a case from 1985 where a family of three were killed at their home, and this man, Arthur Hutchinson, who was otherwise known as the Fox, was the suspect. By the time he was arrested, newspapers already published the names of the murder victims or the people who had been killed, and so it was well known who this family was. And it was only after he was arrested that the police revealed that a teenage girl who survived the attack had also been raped at the home. So she was part of the same family. So that created a problem when it came to the trial, because the family's names were already out there. And yet the law said that the teenage girl who was a victim of a sexual assault, victim of a rape, should have lifelong anonymity. That created an impossible situation, because if you said that she was a member of the family, then she would automatically be identified. Anyone who knew the family would know who it was. In the end, the judge agreed that it was not possible to report on the case effectively without lifting the anonymity of the teenage girl. So that's a situation where sometimes the anonymity has to be lifted in order to allow justice to be able to take place openly. And then just looking at the sexual offences in terms of what the ethical codes say. Remember, we've got the Ofcom code and we've got the IPSO editors code. So Ofcom code talks in particular about identifying children involved in sex cases. So Ofcom says you should avoid identifying children involved in sex cases, and IPSO code says that you should err on the side of caution. So Clause 7 and Clause 11 are basically saying stay away from doing anything which would identify victims of sexual assault or children in sex cases. Naturally, the law overrides that, and we already have an automatic ban on identifying victims of sexual assault, but it's important to be aware that there is an ethical dimension. So have a look at those elements of the ethical codes, Rule 1.8 of the Ofcom Broadcasting Code, and Clause 7 and 11 of the IPSO Editors Code. So please have a look at those. I just wanted to just look at what's the consequences of getting it wrong. Well, you can end up in court if you get it wrong. So here's an example of the BBC Asian Network editor. So a very senior journalist at the BBC has accidentally named, or his staff accidentally named the victim of a sexual assault. So they said that they thought the name in the script was a pseudonym, but it wasn't. It was the real name, and they read it out on air, the actual real name of the victim. So the editor of the network ended up in court and pleaded not guilty. As it turned out, later on he was found not guilty. The court accepted that it was an honest mistake, but you don't want to be going through that situation of facing a court case for breaching anonymity. And I would say that journalist was actually fairly lucky, that you could easily have gone the other way, and the court may have found in another situation could have found them guilty because they breached the law. They identified the victim of a sexual assault. So it's important you know the law and you obey it. It's also worth just being aware that there's a context, there's a climate at the moment where there are campaigns to try and extend anonymity, not only giving it to victims and alleged victims of sexual assault, but also to the people who are accused of or suspected of committing sexual assault. So Cliff Richard was at the centre of a controversy a few years ago where the police raided his home and as part of, I think, Operation U Tree, looking at his allegations of historic sexual abuse. Now, Cliff Richard was completely innocent of that, but the police went there and the BBC reported on it, and they reported that it was Cliff Richard's home was being searched. He has campaigned to say that the law should be changed to make sure that nobody who's just suspected of such a crime should be named until the point that they're actually charged, because at that point there's held to be sufficient evidence. Just be aware of that. So the law hasn't changed at the moment, but you can just see there's some examples of campaigners who are pushing to change the law. So what does that take us to? We looked at some examples at the beginning of this section. We looked at the case of Libby Squire. So she was the student who was raped and murdered in Leeds, and the trial finished in February this year. With Pavel Relovich was convicted of her rape and murder. So why is it that we can give all this detail? Why can we name her? If she had automatic lifelong anonymity, which would ban her name and her university and address and all those things. Well, the sad point here is that he killed her, and therefore the automatic lifelong anonymity expired. Anonymity doesn't extend to dead people. So Libby Squire can be named in this in these reports, and her age and her university and address and details of her family, they can all be published because she sadly is dead. If she had not died, we would not have been able to do that unless we'd sought out a waiver from her in order to lift her own anonymity. And the Alex Salmon case. So this is a sort of odd case. So he was cleared of sexual assault, but the people who made the accusations have retained their anonymity. So this is a good example. So it's sort of the opposite way around to the Libby Squire case, where so here we have someone who's been found not guilty, and yet anonymity remains. So remember, someone who makes an accusation gets automatic lifelong anonymity no matter what happens in terms of an investigation or a prosecution or conviction. So even though Alex Salmon was cleared, the people who accused him of assaulting them retain their anonymity. We cannot name those people. So in this case, they just gave them pseudonyms known as Woman A and Woman B, Woman C, etc. So we cannot name them. If we were to approach them and ask them to provide a written consent to lift that anonymity, and if they chose to do that of their free will, we would be able to name that person, but only the person who had given that consent. So again, it must be in writing, and it must be informed consent. So they must know that they have the right to automatic lifelong anonymity. So it's really important. So hopefully now you can see how important it is on a day-to-day basis that you understand when you can name and when you can't name somebody involved in a sexual offence. Excuse me. So I'm just going to go on to the next brief section before finishing this part of the video. So human trafficking. So human trafficking is covered by the Sexual Offences Act 1992 and the Modern Slavery Act 2015. So we saw the Sexual Offences Act 1992 involved just now. So the restrictions are very similar. So human trafficking is about people basically being brought into modern slavery, being brought into the country for either domestic servitude, to be a cleaner or nanny or whatever it might be, against their will, and being held with no freedom to leave, or it might well be for the purposes of prostitution or for the sex trade. and people being held and forced to do those things. So those people also have a right to anonymity. Sexual Offences Act bans the identity of any alleged victim of human trafficking. And so that's say those examples I've given you, domestic servitude or sexual exploitation. So basically you treat them in the same way, that they get automatic lifelong anonymity as a victim of human trafficking. So there we go. They can waive that anonymity, but like with same as with sexual offences, they can give their consent in writing to waive the anonymity, to lift the anonymity, but they have to be 16 or older, and a parent can't do it for them. So if there's an example of a child who's been brought in for human trafficking, or a child who is the victim of a sexual offence, and their parent says that they're happy to give their consent for them to be named, and they'll sign a letter to say I'm happy for their lifelong anonymity to be waived, they cannot do that. It has to be the person, the actual victim themselves, and they have to be 16 or older. So it's really important you understand when and when you cannot get a consent to name somebody. Okay, so that's sexual offences and human trafficking. I'll move on to another video, a separate video, to look at some of these other issues to do with anonymity.